Hello, folks. My name's Steven. I'm a web developer and software engineer, as well as being a writer. And today I wanted to sit down and talk about ChatGPT, LLMs, and how much we should trust the responses that ChatGPT and LLMs provide us. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and find out more. In terms of what I'd like to talk about today, I want to cover, first of all, just what is ChatGPT as a general primer, and then what is, in my opinion, are some good and bad uses for an LLM like ChatGPT. I want to spend a good amount of time talking about training corpora. So these are the data sets of texts and books that make up the training material that OpenAI used to train ChatGPT. What do we know about what's included in that, and what do we not know about what's included in that? And then specifically talking about a lawsuit that has been brought against OpenAI related to that alleges that they have copyrighted works included in their training data set, and look at issues around copyright with that. And in addition, just touching on the concept of plagiarism as it relates to an LLM. And then when we are using a code generation tool like GitHub Copilot or Meta's Code Llama, what is the concept of rights laundering in relation to the licenses used by the code to train these LLMs? If there's a license on a code that's used to train LLMs, what effect does that have on the ability for you to license the code that one of these tools generates? I think that's a really interesting question. After that, I want to talk a little bit about what I perceive are behavioral problems with LLMs, such as the phenomenon of hallucinations. So I want to talk a lot about hallucinations and also talk about confident wrongness and accuracy generally, the accuracy of LLMs like ChatGPT. After all this, I'd like to just touch on what are some ways that we as users of these tools can approach the use of them, taking these things into consideration to have a better experience using the tools and get more use out of them. So overall, what I'll be talking about is not that we shouldn't use an LLM. I think the LLMs are here to stay and we should kind of adapt to them. But it's how should we use them and how much should we trust them? What is ChatGPT? So ChatGPT is an LLM. I've been saying LLM a lot. LLM stands for large language model. ChatGPT is an LLM. An LLM is a kind of transformer model. A transformer model is a kind of deep neural network machine learning. So if you don't understand what I just said, that's okay. Just want to throw some of these terms out there. I'll be saying LLM a lot. That stands for large language model. ChatGPT specifically, as I said, is a large language model. It's an AI chatbot. So you ask it a question, it will give you an answer. It uses machine learning to understand what you're asking, and it generates kind of as a autocomplete kind of suggestion in the same way when you're texting, there's a text autocomplete. It's quite similar to that, this chatbot will give you an answer. So it's created by OpenAI, the company, and it uses natural language processing to create human-like conversational dialogue. Chatbots have been around for a long time. AI and machine learning have been around for a long time. Natural language processing has been around for a long time. And this is just kind of one of the latest iterations. It's quite impressive what it's able to accomplish. and it has a lot of potential to transform different aspects of society through the use of this tool. It's a very useful tool, and so I think it would be great to learn about it, how it works, and how we can get the best use out of it. What are good and bad uses for an LLM like ChatGPT? In my opinion, good uses for ChatGPT are generating ideas and brainstorming. An example for this is what you can ask ChatGPT, what are 10 ideas for social media posts for marketing professionals? And ChatGPT will give you some ideas of posts you can make on your social media profile. If you want some writing prompts, you can ask ChatGPT for that. If you want to compare and contrast two different issues, this is a great use for this tool. Another great use would be drafting your writing and getting ideas for editing. When I say this, I don't mean to ask ChatGPT for a first draft of something. What I mean is to have already written a draft yourself. Let's say, for example, a professional email. You've drafted a professional email. Then you can take that email, remove any personal or confidential information from it, any identifying information, take that out, and substitute something else. And you can submit that draft that you wrote along with a prompt saying, I would like to have a rewrite of this email. I'd like it to be shorter, but maintain a friendly tone. And ChatGPT will give you a rewrite of your draft. Then you can go through that rewrite and identify if you want to keep any of those ideas that ChatGPT provided you for your rewrite. This is a great way to use this tool. I will often use it this way to get editing ideas. And when you are using your judgment of what to include and what to leave out of what it's provided you, then it kind of mitigates these issues that I'll be talking about as we continue through the presentation. Another great use is investigation and discovery. So a way that I've used ChatGPT is that I couldn't remember the name of a book. So I gave it that identifying information that I could remember about it. And after a couple tries, it found the book that I was looking for. So this is sort of a search engine type use of this tool, but I've been able to get answers from ChatGPT that just Googling something I wasn't able to find. Similarly, you could look up things like in 2019, what are some companies that purchased other companies? If you're just looking into a general topic and you don't need it to be up-to-date information, then using a tool like ChatGPT can really help you discover some stuff that might be difficult to discover otherwise. As far as bad uses for ChatGPT, again, in my opinion, fact checking. Using ChatGPT as a primary tool for fact checking is not a good use. This is because of issues related to hallucinations, issues related to confident wrongness. Also, the time frame of the data sets is it's not up to date. There's a number of reasons why ChatGPT specifically, but LLMs generally, are not a great primary tool for fact checking. I think they can be one piece of a fact-checking process, but as a primary tool, it's not a great use of this tool. Another bad use would be wholly generated writing samples. I think it's a terrible idea to ask ChatGPT to generate a draft from scratch. If you had an eighth grade essay that you needed to write on why Nikola Tesla was an innovator, ChatGPT could give you a short writing sample on that topic. But what I'll tell you right now is that it may not be totally correct, and the writing style will be extremely poor. And in general, that's a point that I'm going to make a few times is that the writing style of ChatGPT is not a good writing style. It's a bad writing style. And so it's important to keep that in mind when using the tool. And last, in terms of bad uses for an LLM, complex problem solving, analysis, statistical analysis, math and logic problems, and coding problems. This sounds a little bit funny because there are multiple LLMs now that are coding assistants like GitHub Copilot and Meta Code Llama. However, when I'm saying coding problems, I mean more so coding problems of the logic type. So if you have a complex logical problem you need to solve in code, in my experience, something like ChatGPT is going to have a relatively low accuracy rate when it comes to solving that problem. Later on, we'll look at a study for ChatGPT 4's ability to identify prime versus composite numbers and how the accuracy rate of ChatGPT 4 went down between March and June. And in general, the accuracy issues with LLMs and with ChatGPT, especially, are such that these tools are not really that great at these problems. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should never use these tools for that purpose. It just means that you should anticipate that an answer you get may be wrong and that you'll need to use your judgment to determine whether or not an answer is correct or not. Opaque corpora. Corpora means it's the plural of the word corpus. The corpora are the data set that OpenAI used to train ChatGPT. A corpus is a collection of texts or a collection of data used by any company to train any kind of machine learning system. In this case, we can talk specifically about LLMs. So each corpus is part of the collection of all of the corpora that are used as the data set to train the LLM. When we talk about ChatGPT, there are many corpora used to train the tool. And the two I want to focus on today are the Books 1 corpus and the Books 2 corpus. While we do know the names of these two corpora, what we do not know are what are actually included in them. That is considered private trade secret by AI. They don't share what's included specifically in their corpora. And for that reason, people have put forward some guesses about what they think could be in there. When we talk about the Books 1 corpus, I did read somewhere that somebody suspected this came from Project Gutenberg. I wouldn't be surprised if Project Gutenberg texts were included in the ChatGPT training dataset. The Project Gutenberg collection are of writing in the public domain. It's something that I frequently use. There's a lot of well-known texts in there, such as the U.S. Constitution and Alice in Wonderland, books like that, which are now in the public domain. We don't know that for sure. Researching it a little bit more, what I found is that other people feel confident that the Books 1 corpus is a well-known corpus called Book Corpus. This is a collection of fiction that was indie published by authors and published for free on a popular website that have very loose copyright restrictions and allow for people to download them for free. And so a lot of people suspect that this well-known corpus is what OpenAI refers to as Books One, and that this is free indie published fiction, largely romance fiction and sci fi. And people think that's what makes up this corpus. The Books Two corpus is an interesting one, and there is speculation online that we're not able to confirm, again, because OpenAI is not transparent about what's included in these, and they say that's their industry trade secret. What people suspect is in this Books 2 corpus, because of the large size of it, is that it's a pirate shadow library. When I refer to a shadow library, what I'm saying is a collection of copyrighted, published books and other texts which are distributed illegally online. In this case, there's a well known shadow library called LibGen. They were operating in the 2010s, had a website, libgen.org, and on their site, they were distributing copyrighted texts such as books, as well as academic studies and other things that had restrictive licenses that they were distributing in violation of those licenses. In 2015, the Southern District of New York, because of a lawsuit brought against LibGen, ordered LibGen to stop operating and to stop using their domain name, libgen.org. And since then, they're no longer operating in public. However, since this information was already out there, if you kind of know where to look online and use torrents, it is possible to illegally download this corpus if you know how to do that. So when people talk about the Books 2 corpus, because of the relatively large size of that corpus, people suspect that what makes that corpus up is a shadow library like LibGen, which includes copyrighted texts. And we'll get a little bit more into that. So, in terms of the use of copyrighted texts by an LLM to train the LLM, there's issues around copyright and fair use. And this can all be well illustrated by a lawsuit filed against OpenAI. It's a class action complaint. It's brought by a well known comedian named Silverman, who is also an author. She has written a book, at least one book, and suspects that her book was included in the training material for ChatGPT. So in the complaint, they allege direct and indirect copyright infringement. They allege unjust enrichment, violations of DMCA law, and other points. And overall, their argument is that they strongly suspect that there's copyrighted material included in the training data set for ChatGPT, and that this violates their intellectual property rights. It infringes on their intellectual property. So as far as the idea of fair use goes, there's a concept in copyright law called fair use that is widely relied upon in places like YouTube and commentary that allows people to use other people's intellectual property to create content about if they are transforming it in some way, such as commenting on it. In my opinion, I think even if ChatGPT were relying on copyrighted material, that most likely it would fall under fair use of that material. The reason I say this is because there's a transforming step that happens in between the use of the text itself and the output of ChatGPT. LLMs are actually called transformers. That's a name that's referred to the kind of model that a large language model is. It's a transformer model. And I think right there you have a very strong argument that this technology is transforming the copyrighted material that it's using as training. So while it is likely that an LLM using copyrighted material for training does constitute fair use of that material, what I think the Sarah Silverman lawsuit says about unjust enrichment feels like a very compelling argument, because while it's not direct copyright infringement, probably by my reading of the situation as somebody who's not a lawyer, uh, what is happening is that ChatGPT is a paid product. ChatGPT 4, you can pay OpenAI to use ChatGPT 4, and a lot of the value out of using ChatGPT 4 comes from the material that ChatGPT was trained on. If OpenAI used copyrighted material in the data set that ChatGPT 4 was trained on, then a lot of that value out of using that product comes from this copyrighted material. And if that material was downloaded from a source that was distributing it illegally, then I think there's a strong argument there that OpenAI is profiting from the use of copyrighted material that it downloaded essentially illegally, in violation of the distribution law of that copyrighted material. In general, I think this issue also begs the question of plagiarism as it relates to the use of an LLM like ChatGPT. If a if an LLM generates a text response for a prompt that you provide it, and a substantial portion of that response, especially if it consecutively includes verbatim text from a piece of writing included in the training data set, then I think there's a strong argument that if you use the response an LLM generates without editing, then you may be plagiarizing some of the text that was used in the training data set. I think this is something that is largely an issue kind of in the educational world, but I think there's also a question of if you use ChatGPT to generate written material for marketing purposes or other professional purposes, and are undertaking the process of enriching yourself or enriching an organization that you work for, if you copy the response from an LLM without editing it at all, I think arguably that constitutes a kind of plagiarism. So I think this is up to the individual. If we're talking about the professional world, I think this is up to individuals to determine themselves what they're comfortable with or not. But in order to make a determination of what constitutes plagiarism and what does not constitute plagiarism, I think it's important to first understand how the tool works in a fairly general sense when using it before deciding to use it in a professional or educational setting. Rights laundering. When I say rights laundering, I'm referring to the issue that arises from the use of code with a particular license in the training set for an LLM compared to what an end user may perceive as their rights using the output of an LLM. Specifically, I'd like to talk about what's referred to as copyleft as opposed to copyright licenses. For open source code, there's a general concept of copyleft licenses. When a piece of code or a repository has a copyleft type open source license, what that license requires is that if anybody uses the code, that when they may edit it and they may distribute it, but if they edit and distribute this code, the subsequent versions that somebody has edited and distributed also needs to retain a copyleft license itself. In other words, anybody else should be able to go in and take that code, copy it, modify it, distribute it. And if somebody does that, it has to perpetuate this copyleft license so that it's free to use for all time. So, what would happen if an LLM like ChatGPT, like GitHub Copilot, like Meta Code Llama, if in their training data sets for their code generation, LLMs, they included code that was published originally openly under a copyleft license? Hypothetically, if ChatGPT had included these open source code repositories in their training data set. And then as a user, I go in, I ask a code related problem. If the if the code that ChatGPT then generates based on my prompt is identical to some code that comes from a repository that's open source and has a copyleft license. If I then take that code and and have a private license on it, where I'm using it for profit in a business context, then I may be violating that original license that that code was originally published under. This is the concept of rights laundering generally, and it's one that these major code generation platforms have not seemed to directly address in any substantial way. I've really gone looking for this, and what I found I think is very informative in some ways, because GitHub Copilot has a policy that says that if you use their tool and you are in a corporation and you are licensing their tool under the corporate license, if you disallow public code from being included in the training data set that you use when you're using GitHub Copilot, then if anybody makes a claim against you that you are infringing on their intellectual property rights or violating the license of the code that they published, then GitHub will defend you in court against such a claim. As I said, there's a few restrictions on this. You have to be a corporation. You have to be licensing the tool under the corporate license structure. And you have to select an option that disallows the inclusion of public code in the training data set that's used for Copilot. And the fact that there's this option to disallow public code when using GitHub Copilot shows that there's an understanding, at least, that there's a risk that somebody could say that a large corporation copied their open source code and made it closed source for their own personal profit. So somebody could sue a corporation saying, you took our code and published it privately because Copilot returned some copyleft code, and then you used it for your own, private enrichment and didn't open source it. So GitHub understands that it's possible for someone to bring a lawsuit of this sort, and to respond to this, they've added the option to disallow the use of public code, and then they'll also defend corporate clients in court. So clearly, there is a known issue around license violations as it relates to code generators, yet, really, the only public discourse is about how these organizations creating these tools will defend themselves and will defend their clients, potentially the users of their software, if one of these lawsuits come about. What I do not see a lot of is a recognition of the fact that the potential value coming from the code generation tools may be contingent on the training material, which may have been published under a copyleft open source license. And in my mind, it's actually a clear violation of an open source license to use code in this way, as opposed to the published nonfiction Sarah Silverman example, where that's more of a fair use kind of use of that. This seems more cut and dry, that because these code licenses, I think, have clear stipulations that you can't really use their open source code to take and transform and then publish under a private license. So to me, it's actually more cut and dry that this would be a violation of license. And yet what we see is not so much efforts to reconcile this as much as to defend the organizations releasing code generator tools and potentially defending their clients. Who is not defending their clients is Meta. So Meta, formerly known as Facebook, recently released their Code Llama tool. And I went looking into their agreement to see if they address the issue of rights laundering, and potentially if, like GitHub, they would be willing to defend the users of their tool in court if somebody brought an intellectual infringement claim against a user of Code Llama. I did not find that, but what I did find was that if you make any allegation in court that Code Llama produced infringes on your intellectual property rights, then your license to use Code Llama is immediately terminated. And I think they probably did this because if you are trying to prove that their tool is generating code that you originally wrote, it'll be more difficult for you to prove that if you don't have continued access to the tool. But it really comes across as saying, if you make any accusation in court that Code Llama infringes on your intellectual property rights by the code that it generates, then you can't use Code Llama anymore. You're out of the club. And so it just really cracks me up that they did that. We don't have any issue around the resolution of rights laundering as it relates to open source code that they almost certainly use to train. We don't know what they use to train, but I would speculate that it might be in there. But they don't talk about that. They only talk about if you make an allegation that it did, then you lose the right to use the software. So that just really cracks me up. So moving on from the topic of the training corpora and the issues with the licenses relating to the training corpora of LLMs, I want to talk about behavioral problems with the use of LLMs. One of the biggest problems using an LLM is the phenomenon of hallucinations. Hallucinations is a term that refers to the capacity of these tools to make stuff up, essentially, to represent facts as true when they're not necessarily true. I personally have experienced this a number of times, many times, and there's evidence in public now of this happening. So a kind of more inconsequential or innocent issue around this are if you ask a celebrity's birth date, then it can just give you the wrong date. It's just simple as that. Sometimes it will tell you a fact about somebody or something, and it's just not true. This is well documented. And another example that's a little more consequential, The Verge published this story, and this story was making the rounds a little while ago about a self-styled AI lawyer. So a lawyer who was depending on AI to help him in his job. And this lawyer submitted a filing in a case. And in that filing, he cited 6 cases that just they don't exist. So he had used probably, I believe, ChatGPT. He used ChatGPT to generate some of the text of this filing and to include some citations related to this issue. And 6 of the citations in the filing they were not real. They sounded good, but they were made up. So what happened in this case is that this lawyer generated, this text and generated text that included these citations, and then he did not think to go through the citations and confirm the veracity of them. And he submitted the filing to court with false citations in them that ChatGPT had made up. So I think what this lawyer may not have understood about ChatGPT and about LLMs in general is that this is a statistical model that generates text based on probabilities of what the most next likely word will be in a sequence. So another way to say that is that LLMs are generating text that is supposed to sound good. It's supposed to be what is what somebody is expecting. That is very different than generating something that's true and accurate and verified. So veracity is not the primary goal of a tool like ChatGPT. The primary goal is to sound good, to be what is probably what somebody expects. And so, to go back to the earlier slide of good and bad uses for ChatGPT, it's very bad at fact checking because it makes stuff up. So if a tool is making facts up, then you can't really trust it to tell you what's true and what's not true. So, in the industry, the issue of hallucination is well known by people who build LLMs and who, promote them, and who are building their businesses potentially on LLMs. It's very well known that hallucinations occur. People like Stephen Wolfram even, point out that there's potential benefits to the way that LLMs hallucinate. They're creative and that they can give you kind of unexpected insights on an issue. However, the general public, I don't think, necessarily understands that ChatGPT will make stuff up. It won't make stuff up 100% of the time, but it also will make stuff up more than 0% of the time. So when you're using this tool, you understand that at any time, it could give you an answer that may include something that's not factual, but that may sound good. That will change how you use the tool, I think. And so, I think in order to understand the best applications for LLMs, the fact that they hallucinate needs to be considered, especially when talking about where and how it can be used. Related to hallucinations is the concept of confident wrongness. This is not an official term necessarily. This is just kind of a colloquial way to refer to this phenomenon that occurs. Have found it mostly with ChatGPT, but it has potential to happen with any kind of LLM. Confident wrongness is when ChatGPT has hallucinated an answer for you. It's given you a wrong answer, and then you provide it with evidence and logic showing that that previous answer was wrong, and ChatGPT continues to insist that it was correct. I have personally experienced this, and it's otherwise a well known phenomenon. And so the issue around this isn't so much for people who understand that LLMs hallucinate. If you understand that an answer that ChatGPT gives you could be wrong, then you will have this layer of understanding which allows you to parse what it's saying without necessarily trusting in everything it says. On the other hand, if you don't necessarily understand how an AI chatbot works and you assume that there's some level of fact checking, if you assume that there are guardrails around correctness, and make an assumption that almost all of the time this chatbot is going to give you a correct answer, then when you present it with information to the contrary and it continues to insist that it was correct, that can be very confusing. So I think this is a greater issue for people who are less technical, who are trying to use the tool, who maybe don't understand the intricacies and the subtleties of the model behind the scenes. I don't think somebody who uses the tool should necessarily need to have that deep of an understanding of how the technology works, but we need to call out this phenomenon where the tool will say, no, actually, I'm right. My answer was correct, even when it wasn't, so that, we can engage kind of in some education and really become aligned with everybody that this is something that can happen. So if you understand that an LLM can hallucinate and that it will even continue to insist that it was right when presented with evidence to the contrary, if you understand these things about it, it changes how you relate to the software and how you use the software. And it's something that I think is not talked about widely enough. Accuracy. So in on July 18th, there was a study published called How is ChatGPT's Behavior Changing Over Time? And it looked at accuracy rates over time for things like solving math problems and solving coding problems. It's an interesting read. It's not that hard of a read. I'd recommend checking out the link included there if you'd like to learn more. One of the major points of the study was that if we look at ChatGPT 4, between March and June, the accuracy of its ability to identify prime numbers compared to composite numbers went down. So in March, the accuracy was 84%, which is not that good. But in June, the rate went down to 51%. So half of the time, ChatGPT's answers to questions about which numbers are prime, um, half of the time it was wrong. But GPT-4 is the cutting edge version, and its accuracy solving math problems decreased between March and June. If you take that into consideration, I think it begs a question of how useful is this tool in solving math problems when it's only has about a 50% accuracy rate. There still may be ways that this tool is useful. Maybe it can help you triangulate a solution if you request multiple solutions to the same problem. But I think we have to understand the accuracy rates, and be, forthcoming and be honest about what they are in order for us to be able to get use out of the tool. Because what I think people don't necessarily understand as casual users of this tool is that this accuracy rate is so low. Because again, ChatGPT, the goal of this software is not to provide a correct answer to a prompt, it's to provide an answer that sounds good. To close out, I want to talk about solutions to some of the issues that I've brought up in this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about solutions on the developer side, and then more relevant to you and me as potential users of the software. What are ways that we can approach the use of it to get the most out of it, considering everything that we've talked about so far? So, first, to cover the developer side solutions, we've got retrieval augmented generation, specialized training corpora, and output guardrails. Output guardrails is something that's already widely in use with LLMs and with other kinds of machine learning technology that exists in the world. This refers to a general practice of adding additional layers, typically outside of the scope of the actual machine learning process itself. It's something to kind of bookend the machine learning process. These are things put in place to control what the potential output of a LLM can be. So, an example would be that an LLM is not allowed to generate hateful or violent type of speech. There's a guardrail in place which is checking for the prompts that people provide, and if somebody prompts a tool like ChatGPT to generate speech that is violent, then there's a guardrail which prevents ChatGPT from doing that. This is already in use, and I would expect the use of guardrails to expand over time and become more sophisticated. This will help LLMs understand what people are asking for and give them relevant, safe, legal responses to their prompts. And so this is a way that developers can address issues around accuracy and can address potential issues around licensing and copyright and plagiarism. Specialized training corpora, again, this is something that's already in use. Specifically, if you look at the code generation tools like Copilot and Code Llama, these tools have specialized corpora for training as opposed to ChatGPT, which has very large, very general corpora that's used for its training. So the code generation tools would not include indie published romance fiction in their training corpora because the goal of the LLM is to generate code, it's not to generate fiction. I would anticipate and make a cautious kind of speculation about where these things are going to go, that in the future, there's a likelihood that we're going to see more small focused LLMs as opposed to the general purpose chat GPT type LLM. And like the code generators, these will have specialized training corpora which are custom fit to the use of that specific LLM. So if it would be fiction writing, maybe there would be a fiction LLM specifically, and that this would train almost exclusively on fiction that it had the rights to use. You could have a business type LLM that trained on business writing. And so I think a great way to get a use out of an LLM is to have more focused use and have specialized training corpora. And I would expect to see more of these as time goes on. Finally, there's a concept of retrieval augmented generation. This concept precedes the release of ChatGPT. This has been around for several years at least. And retrieval augmented generation is a way to have more accurate and factual responses to prompts in LLMs. So it can address some of this issue with hallucinations. That said, I would love to read more about the use of retrieval augmented generation and see what potential improvements in accuracy they're able to gain. I haven't found that much information about this specifically besides pretty general stuff. So if you know of anything of the use studies, for instance, of the use of retrieval augmented generation for LLMs, I would love to see that. So please share that with me. And for the meantime, I think we could expect to see the use of retrieval augmented generation in focused uses of LLMs, such as customer service chatbots used by specific companies. Uh, those companies may train the LLMs to use retrieval augmented generation to produce answers specific to the company that have a high accuracy rate. So, all of that said, for the developer side solutions to these issues, how can we as users, understanding how LLMs work in the current day, which happens to be August 29th, 2023, um, today, as ChatGPT is today, how can we understand how it works and change our use of the tool to get more value out of that use? The primary thing, and essentially the entire point that I'm trying to make, is that LLMs require human editors with judgment and intent to interpret their responses. I make this point because I see a lot of discussion of ChatGPT as being something that's going to replace people's jobs and that it will completely upend the way that things work. And it will surely have a large impact, and it already is having a large impact. But what it can't do is completely replace the human element in almost any of these situations. If you think about a marketer who uses ChatGPT to generate some content for a social media post, that marketer needs to read through the response that ChatGPT generates. It needs to edit the content that ChatGPT generates and decide what to include and what not to include. If you were to take the responses that ChatGPT generated and without reading or editing them, publish them, in a professional context, there are going to be some bad consequences that come from that action, because the quality of the writing style is not good. There are positive things to say about it, but overall, as a general statement, the writing style of ChatGPT is not a good writing style. Furthermore, there may be factual errors in something that ChatGPT generates. We've already covered this. It could hallucinate. You need to edit the response to make sure that there's no hallucinations. You need to fact check all of the information included in a response that an LLM generates to make sure that it's correct. And you need to do this all of the time, which brings us to our next point. If you assume that everything an LLM generates needs to be fact checked and confirmed, it will change the way that you use the tool. So when you have it generate code for you, for instance, you need to run that code yourself and confirm that it does what you asked it to do. I know that seems like a basic concept and that it should go out without saying, but clearly it doesn't go without saying because people are using the tool in this way. They're having ChatGPT generate code for them and then using that without double checking that it works or not and double checking that it does what it says that it's meant to do. So even putting aside issues with licensing, putting that aside, just fact checking and confirming that the response is what you wanted it to be. I don't think everybody does that, and I think that's a really serious problem. And the only way to really address that is to kind of emphasize the fact that if we're talking about an 84% accuracy rate, if a tool has an 84% accuracy rate, I'm going to double check it every time because there's such a high chance that something could be wrong that there's no way around the need to fact check it 100% of the time. So in order to get more use out of these tools, if you understand that the accuracy rate is not great and you approach the use of the tool with the assumption that you need to fact check everything, then I think, it changes how you use it and you can get more value out of it. That's my entire point here. Finally, scoped use. So a scoped use in a business context would be the use of an LLM as a customer support chatbot. So that little annoying pop-up on the bottom right corner of websites that say, hey, I've noticed you've been on the site for 2 seconds. Would you like to talk to a customer support agent? Those things drive me wild, but you can use an AI chatbot to field questions from customers and provide answers for them. So a customer may want to know what a return policy is, and your chatbot might be able to use, for instance, some retrieval augmented generation to share with the customer that the return policy is 90 days. After you buy something, you have 90 days to return it. And an AI chatbot is a great interface that allows for people to organically ask questions and get those questions answered without relying on a human agent. And that will free up your human customer support agents to do more important, subtle work. What would not be a scoped use is if a customer, was asking why their order hadn't arrived yet. And if you were to use a chatbot to ask them what their order number is, what their address is, what their order date was, what their other private information was, and then it was looking stuff up, trying to find information, and all of this kind of complex, subtle things that go into customer support, that's not a great use for this tool. You shouldn't use a tool like this to be processing private information. Don't provide private or confidential information to ChatGPT. But more importantly, a chatbot isn't going to necessarily understand the subtlety of an issue where somebody's order didn't arrive on time. Instead, what you can use the chatbot for is to say, um, you know, here's the customer support phone number. When you call, they're going to ask you what your order number is and what your address is. So make sure you have that information on hand and have a great day. So that would be a scoped use of an LLM. Another example of scoped use would be for drafting ideas and editing ideas, as I covered before. If you created a first draft, asked ChatGPT for a rewrite, and then picked and chose from that rewrite editing ideas that you wanted to reincorporate into your writing, that's a scoped use compared to asking ChatGPT to generate an essay from scratch. that's not a scoped use. So when we're approaching the use of something like ChatGPT, we can identify ways to use it which are very useful and appropriate, and then not be asking this tool to do things that it's not good at. So it's not good at drafting essays from scratch. So don't ask it to do that. So that's a way you can approach the use of the tool to get the most use out of it. Don't trust the responses that an LLM like ChatGPT generates. This is not to say that you shouldn't use LLMs. It's to say that you should approach the responses that LLMs generate as if you have a low confidence level in the accuracy and quality of that response. And in a way, this makes it sound like I'm kind of really knocking on this technology, but I'm not. I'm a user of code generation tools. I'm a user of ChatGPT. But the way that I approach the responses that it gives me is that I assume that any information in it needs to be fact checked and can be inaccurate. And I assume that just because it expresses some kind of opinion about something, that opinion might not be a good one, and that the writing style may be it may be clear and direct, but it may not be a good writing style. And taking that approach to the output, I can approach it with this degree of skepticism, and approaching it in this skeptical way allows me to pick and choose what I want to take and what I want to leave from the responses that the tool generates. And I have found this has really improved the way my interactions with the tool, accepting it as it is, as having low accuracy, as having a bad writing style, allows me to use it to improve my own writing. It allows me to use it to do problem solving, by not assuming that the answers that it provides are correct. I think it's still useful, and but the way that I can get the most use out of it is by understanding its limitations. It's really the whole point of what I'd like to communicate today. And thanks for sticking with me as I tried to make that point. I've got a few references here, and as I go through them, I'll just close out the video. I will be publishing this slide deck on my personal website, and I will be sharing that PDF wherever I publish this video. And so if you're curious to learn more about any of the details of what I've said here, feel free to check out my references, the different articles and papers and websites that I've used to kind of collect all my arguments and information. If you have any feedback on anything I've said today, if you agreed with me, I would love to hear that. If you didn't agree with me, I would also be curious to hear about your opinion. I'm really not trying to knock this technology. I like this technology. I think it's here to stay. But I just think it's important to understand the limitations of it as it is and allow that understanding to change how we use the technology. And if we do that, I think we can get more use out of it. So feel free to check out my references. Thanks very much for listening. Share any feedback you have with me. I'd really love to hear it. And have a great day. Thanks.